Hello, and welcome to the 10th chapter of our Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe read-through. I'm Jem, the reader at St John the Baptist Parish Church in Beeston, and the chapter we're going to be looking at this time is The Spell Begins to Break. So if you haven't read chapter 10, buzz off and read it. It runs from, "Now we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and the other three children," and it runs to, "But long before they had finished enjoying themselves, Mr. Beaver said, 'Time to be moving on now.'" There are a few things that struck me and jumped out at me in this chapter, perhaps rather more haphazardly than in other chapters, because unlike the ones we've been talking about recently, not an awful lot of plot happens here. There are a couple of chapters where it's mostly stasis and what we might think of as sort of thematic development, rather than lots and lots of narrative. Perhaps it's a bit unfair given that the beavers are involved, and as we all know, when the beavers are there, this is a good novel, and the beavers are obviously the central characters in many ways. But there seems to be a certain amount of waiting for things to kick in later on. But there are some interesting details when they're preparing to leave the beaver's house. Mrs. Beaver wanders around packing. Mr. Beaver complains that she's not going fast enough. They're concerned with which domestic items they should take. There's this bit where she says, "Well, I'm nearly ready now," answered Mrs. Beaver at last, allowing her husband to help her into her snow boots. "I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring?" "Yes, it is," said Mr. Beaver, "a great deal too heavy. And don't think you'll be able to use it while we're on the run, I suppose." "I can't abide the thought of that witch fiddling with it," said Mrs. Beaver, "and breaking it or stealing it as likely as not." Which is, obviously a comic moment where she shows her sort of domestic concerns in the face of this extraordinary situation they're in. But it reminded me of some other books from around the same period. It really underlined to me the extent to which, and I know I've been saying this a lot, this is a war novel, or a novel about the political and military situation of the mid-20th century, because it reminded me of Ian Serralia's The Silver Sword, which was published a couple of years after this book, which is a much more realistic and a much more gritty, and I don't mean to trivialise that book by comparing it to the beavers pottering around looking at sewing machines and dams, but that's a novel about children on the run in Europe from the Nazis. But something about my memories of reading that book as a child connected with this when I read it. The combination of this overwhelming feeling of panic and doom, and that there are these huge forces sort of sweeping across history, but it's embedded in these domestic details. And that's something we noticed when we looked at Lewis writing on Bunyan, 2 chapters ago now, when he talked about bringing the great romance tradition and the tradition of chivalry, but writing it for Bunyan in a domestic sense, in the language that you might find people using in a rural pub somewhere in England. And that concern with small things, with possessions, with things you love, and being able to take them with you or not being able to take them with you, I suppose connected to the image of the silver sword, the little item that goes missing in Sir Ryler's novel, and made it seem more real, made it seem less like these were people who were unbelievably noble and astonishingly good, and connected it to that sense that when things are really dramatically bad, like nationally or internationally or globally bad, people don't suddenly stop caring about small things. They don't suddenly stop thinking that their sewing machine is really nice and they can't bear anyone to touch it. I really like that idea of the idea of this wicked witch who will come and most likely mess up the sewing machine. And it connected also to the character of Ariette's mother in The Borrowers. Again, another novel that was published a couple of years after this. And it was only recently when I was watching the BBC adaptation of The Borrowers that it struck me again just what a war novel that is. Or certainly a novel about the Blitz, or about perhaps refugees and movements of people at that time. When I'd previously looked at it, I'd seen sort of Ariette, and I'd seen her desire for adventure and her questing spirit. And rewatching it, perhaps as an older person, slightly older person, I saw her mother's worries and her father's almost despair at times that we were going to have to move on again and they won't let us stay. And whenever we try and make a home for ourselves, they'll find out and they'll move us on and it's not safe. Again, her mother, Ariette's mother, gets a lot of stick in that novel, I think, for being a sort of foolish, domestic, material-obsessed woman who can't see the broader horizons of adventure. But it really, when I watched the adaptation and saw their house being destroyed from above and all the flashing lights, it struck me weird what a Blitz novel or a refugee novel that is, about this desire for comfort and the sadness of having to keep moving on from things and places that are going to be smashed up. So as I say, that's a lot to read into the detail of the sewing machine, but I don't think that sequence is there accidentally, nor is it just, I think, there to poke fun at silly women who don't understand the glories of questing and the glories of world events. It roots it in a very specific experience. The place they go to also gave me pause for thought. So they go out on their moonlight escape, and they pad over the snow. And she found Mr. Beaver was just vanishing into a little hole in the bank, which had been almost hidden under the bushes till you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realised what was happening, only his short, flat tail was showing. Lucy immediately stooped and down and crawled in after him. Then she heard noises of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her, and in a moment all 5 of them were inside. "Wherever is this?" said Peter's voice, sounding tired and pale in the darkness. I hope you know what I mean by a voice sounding pale. "It's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times," said Mr. Beaver, "and a great secret. It's not much of a place, but we must get a few hours' sleep." Now, that location, this hiding place of old known to beavers in bad times, does something to the temporal structure of the novel. That's very subtle. I maundered on a bit at the beginning of this series, in the first episode, about the different kinds of time that were operating in the novel. The wants of romance and questing adventures and fairy tale and folklore, and this happened during the war that's just over, when this particular political and economic set of circumstances, which we call evacuation, happened. And the idea that there are 2 kinds of time brought together. That, of course, as I didn't mention at the time, is a crucial notion in the Christian faith and indeed the Jewish faith. The idea that God operates in history, and that the historical time, the genealogical time, the quotidian time, is also the time of marvels and the supernatural breaking in upon that time, or indeed operating through that time. And here we seem to have a slight shading of the kind of time that's happening. There's been an emphasis so far on stasis, on the fact that things don't change, that there's this awful, locked, frozen, wintry time. And there used to be summers, there used to be great time, there used to be sort of the time that's kept alive by talking about and telling stories. And those two seem to be disjointed. Here, I was really interested by this little hint that Narnia has historical time. It doesn't just have the golden age when it was all good and the seasons happen naturally, and Silenus and Bacchus were around, and the Naiads and the Dryads were there, and then this disjunct, this continual present. It has gradations, this suggestion that there are bad times in history, and people have weathered them by going into these hiding places and sort of waiting things out. That there's not just these 2 states, but that time flows through bad times and can go out again. Now, as I say, it's a relatively small point, and I'm not suggesting that C.S. Lewis was drawing graphs of concepts of time, but I think it's interesting that as the chapter called "The Spell Begins to Break" develops, we start seeing a more historical, a more narrative form of time developing through here. And I think it is the first suggestion we've had that there's such a thing as fighting against bad times like this, and that time linearly flows through them and will come out the other side. This is, of course, as we will discover in later chapters, perhaps because Aslan is on the move, and that supernatural kind of time is beginning to operate and to cooperate, we might say, within linear and historical time. Then comes one of the passages that a lot of people remember very fondly from this novel. I've suggested that perhaps Turkish Delight is the most famous sequence of the novel. This is some people's favourite bit, where a certain character arrives. In fact, they were all sitting up with their mouths and eyes wide open, listening to a sound which was the very sound they'd all been thinking of and sometimes imagining they heard during their walk last night. It was the sound of jingling bells. Now, I've previously suggested that the arrival of the White Witch is a bit of a bait and switch in this novel, where the novel tells us about these white reindeer who seem a bit magical, and then we see a harness with bells on it, and we see a little elf-like or dwarf-like man who's wearing polar bear skin and a cap with a tassel on it, and then there's an extraordinary person in the sledge, and you and I and everyone are thinking, Father Christmas, and of course it's not, it's the White Witch, who is the sort of inverse of Father Christmas. She's pale, she's sort of pinched and thin, she takes away rather than giving. She is white with little red touches of red rather than being red with little touches of white. Here, the characters have been terrified of hearing a harness of jingling bells, and they hear it, and Mr. Beaver goes off to see what it is, and comes back and says, it's all right, it's not her. And Father Christmas turns out to be there and says, oh, she's kept me out for many years, but I've managed to break in. And I thought it's an interesting moment, and it's one of the moments where we might pause to think about one of the puzzles surrounding this novel. Indeed, it was a definite problem, a disqualifying problem as far as Tolkien was concerned, because as you probably know, Tolkien really didn't like Narnia. He didn't think it was how you should write fantasy novels. He didn't like it so much that it wasn't read out at the gatherings of the Inklings, where other books like Out of the Silent Planet and The Lord of the Rings, and I think All Hallows Eve were read by members of that group. And one of the things that we think Tolkien didn't like about it was this blending of different kinds of fantasy. Tolkien's often praised as an incredibly coherent writer. You know, he has geography and history and prehistory and creation myth, and he has linguistics, and he has a coherent sense of how these cultures in his fantasy world operated, and he could tell you at any point what was going on elsewhere in the world whilst a particular event was happening. Lewis doesn't have this. Lewis appears to have things all just jumbled together and stirred up in a sort of stew. So we have naiads and dryads, and we also have fauns, or as I've suggested, Pan, and we also have Father Christmas, and we also have talking animals, and we also have this divine figure of a lion. These things don't seem to have been sorted out or synthesized in any one way. Perhaps typified by a student who asked me when I was teaching this text this last semester, how can there be Father Christmas? After all, there hasn't been a nativity. There's no sense in which Father Christmas is connected to the birth of Aslan. If Aslan is a representation of Jesus, then how come there is a Father Christmas in this world who's trying to get in, who breaks in? And it may be too simple to say that Aslan is a representation of Jesus, but this is a good point. I think it points to the disjunction of the mythical supernatural elements in this text. And I think my solution, or my expounding of that problem is twofold. One, that Lewis was deeply drawn towards, as we know, folklore and myth and legend, and that it was part of his personal journey back to the Christian faith. That he, like a lot of intellectuals and writers, thinkers at the time, was deeply influenced by the advances in things like history and anthropology and understanding of other cultures that happened during the late 19th century and the early 20th century. This great relativizing of the meta-narrative of Christianity, which also happened in things like Marxism and psychoanalysis. But perhaps the best, or the most striking example for our purposes is the writing of The Golden Bough by Fraser, where Oh Fries Wide Love, not on the book. Sorry, hang on a sec. I apologise. That was our cat Frieswide making a determined effort on the volume. But yes, The Golden Bough, in which Fraser records myths and legends of other cultures, and part of his project is to show, or during that project, he shows just how similar the idea of dying and rising gods are in other cultures to that of Christianity. And part of his purpose there is to chip away at the idea of the uniqueness of Christianity, to suggest that actually what seems to be the defining and singular myth of this religion just happens everywhere. It's a perfectly natural thing to do, like people have fertility cults or they have sky gods or whatever. And this, there's no reason to think that Christianity is anything different than a normal set of myths that has developed. Now, for Lewis, as I understand it, that was a powerful argument, but it was also his way back in that he gradually came to believe, not least with discussions with Hugo Dyson and Tolkien, and he dates one particular walk through the gardens at Magdalen late in an evening where they discuss this, the idea that this does not disprove Christianity, but rather suggests that the truth of the Christian myth was splintered and shattered and scattered through all sorts of cultures, that myths of dying and rising gods in other cultures don't don't take precedence over Christianity. Rather, they're preparations in human culture for the final revelation of God in Christ Jesus. So for Lewis, the idea of lots of other myths and legends, and indeed his attraction, his fascination, his love for other myths and legends, is both potentially a threat to his Christian devotion, but also one of the ways in which he worked his way back to it. So I think the specificity of things like naiads and Father Christmas and talking animals is important to Lewis, because he loves them, he feels drawn to them, and for him, through them, shines the path to Christian truth. He's also, I think, a determined universalist, not in the sense of origin and universality of salvation, but a universalist in that he believes that if Christianity is true, then it is true at all times for all people. But it is not. I think he would have little sympathy for the idea that Christianity is one of an enormous number of paths to God, and that it doesn't really matter which path that you tread. For him, Christianity is a historical religion. It's a religion that concerns human history and defining and definitive interventions in human history by God and definitive revelations of God. And so, if Christianity is true, then it is true for people who lived with beliefs in naiads and dryads, and it's true for people who hung up stockings for St. Nicholas or Father Christmas, and it's true for people who believed in talking animals or told stories about talking animals. I think that one of the reasons for gathering all these mythologies together is to bring them into a synthesis, though I suggest they're not synthesized the way Tolkien did, but bring them into a synthesis in which Christian truth can make sense of all of them. So partly I think that the disjunction is the point. They're supposed to be a working through of the way in which Aslan can connect to and can make sense of all these different kinds of mythology. And that those aren't necessarily stumbling blocks to Christian truth. They can indeed be paths to Christian truth. Now, the reason I've gone slightly around the houses on this is that I think that Father Christmas here fits into that. We've already seen a certain amount of talk about Pan in the novel and in these episodes, or what's to say, Tumnus, which I interpret as a figure of Pan. Now, a listener to these episodes, Penelope Wallace, has very kindly written to me and pointed out some much better examples than the ones I gave of Pan in writings of people at the time. I should point out, she didn't say they were much better examples. She very kindly just said, oh, here are some interesting examples. That's me. They are much better examples. It's me saying that they're better. She didn't email me to tick me off and tell me I'd got bad examples. But they are better examples. She points out that in Dorothy L. Sayers' play, The Man Born to be King, about the life of Christ, Pilate's wife had a dream, as indeed she did in the gospel narratives, but that dream is fleshed out, and it involves her hearing the voice saying, the great god Pan is dead. And she said, how can Pan die? And she's told, we crucified him, don't you remember? And this is woven into a long tradition in Western culture that Pan was the only god who actually died. And there is this cry that's recorded of sailors crying out to the ship, the great god Pan is dead. And I believe this became, as I understand it from scholars saying, this became associated with the idea that Pan was an image of Christ, or again, in the rather Golden Bough sense, that simply Pan was another example of a dying god who we can then dissolve the Christian revelation into just another local myth, as it were. Also, she points out that in G.K. Chesterton's novel, The Man Who Was Thursday, the how to give a sketch of the plot of that novel. I won't try, you can go and read it yourselves. But part of the plot of that novel is a group of anarchists on an anarchist council who are all named after the days of the week, and this is one of the least weird parts of that novel. And they're all brought together by the chief anarchist, the president, a man called Sunday, and then he's gone, disappeared, and they're remembering how he seemed very different to each one of them. And I'll read you a passage from that novel. Syme's eyes were still fixed upon the errant orb, which, reddened in the evening light, looked like some rosier and more innocent world. Have you noticed an odd thing, he said, about your descriptions? Each man of you found Sunday quite different, yet each man of you can only find one thing to compare him to, the universe itself. Bull finds him like the earth in spring, Gogol like the sun at noonday. The secretary is reminded of the shapeless protoplasm, the inspector of the carelessness of virgin forests. The professor says he is like a changing landscape. This is queer, but it is queerer still that I also have my odd notion about the president, and I also find that I think of Sunday as I think of the whole world. Get on along a little faster, said Bull. Never mind the balloon. When I first saw Sunday, said Syme slowly, I only saw his back, and when I saw his back I knew he was the worst man in the world. His neck and shoulders were brutal, like those of some apish god. His head had a stoop that was hardly human, like the stoop of an ox. In fact, I had at once the revolting fancy that this was not a man at all, but a beast dressed up in man's clothes. Get on, said Dr. Bull. And then the queer thing happened. I had seen his back from the street, as he sat on the balcony. Then I entered the hotel, and coming round the other side of him, saw his face in the sunlight. His face frightened me, as it did everyone, but not because it was brutal, not because it was evil. On the contrary, it frightened me because he was so beautiful, because it was so good. Syme, exclaimed the secretary, are you ill? It was like the face of some ancient archangel, judging justly after heroic wars. There was laughter in the eyes, and in the mouth honour and sorrow. There was the same white hair, the same great grey-clad shoulders that I had seen from behind. But when I saw him from behind, I was certain he was an animal. When I saw him in front, I knew he was a god. Pan, said the professor dreamily, was a god and an animal. And there's another sequence later on when they're talking about that someone compares him to Pan. There was no need for anyone to cry out to Syme, who had never taken his eyes off it. He saw the great luminous globe suddenly stagger in the sky, right itself, then sink slowly behind the trees like a setting sun. The man called Gogol, who had hardly spoken through all their weary travels, suddenly threw up his hands like a lost spirit. He is dead, he cried. And now I know he was my friend in the dark. Dead, snorted the secretary. You will not find him dead easily. If he has been tipped out of the car, we shall find him rolling as a colt rolls in a field, kicking his legs for fun. Clashing his hooves, said the professor. The colts do, and so did Pan. Pan again, said Dr. Bull irritably. You seem to think Pan is everything. So he is, said the professor. In Greek, he means everything. Don't forget, said the secretary, looking down, that he also means panic. Anyway, that great, glorious Chestertonian rolling phrases there, we can see the working out of a comparison, I think, obviously, between Pan and Christ. Another thing that we can see in the Sayers comparison, the idea that Pan is dead and we crucified him. And again, the reason why I've gone this way around is that the appearance of the Pan figure that we can recognise from things like The Wind in the Willows or Murder Must Advertise or The Man Who Was Thursday or The Man Born to be King in this novel is then succeeded by the Father Christmas figure. And he's quite an extraordinary Father Christmas. I'll quote, "He was a huge man in a bright red robe, bright as hollyberries, with a hood that had fur inside it and a great white beard that fell like a foamy waterfall over his chest. Everyone knew him because though you see people of his sort only in Narnia, you see pictures of them and hear them talked about, even in our world, the world on this side of the wardrobe door. But when you really see them in Narnia, it is rather different. Some of the pictures of Father Christmas in our world make him look only funny and jolly. But now that the children actually stood looking at him, they didn't find it quite like that. He was so big and so glad and so real that they all became quite still. They felt very glad, but also solemn." And there's something in this different kind of Father Christmas, this larger and more real and more solemn Father Christmas, that I think suggests that we're seeing a gradual revelation that's going to be completed by Aslan. We're seeing some hints of Aslan's reality and Aslan's truth and divinity in the figure of Mr. Tumnus, who first introduces Lucy to this extraordinary world and tells her all about the wonderful ways it used to be, but of course is in one sense morally corrupt because he's leading her away in order to originally give her over to the White Witch. And then we see Father Christmas, who is again a sort of a folkloric figure, though obviously, of course, with a strong Christian legendary substrate of St. Nicholas. And he is joyous and also solemn, and that he's almost unbearably real, and that he's sort of very impressive to the children. And then in not so long, we're going to see Aslan himself. I wonder whether in these figures we're seeing the characters and indeed the reader being prepared for Aslan, being shown, as I say, some elements that they could pick up by looking at folklore, by looking at the legends of Pan, by wandering around woods and feeling that the strong tug, I think, towards paganism, or at least nature worship, in this novel that a lot of novels at the time felt. And then seeing the jollity and the joy of the feast of the Incarnation, the Christmas tide, and Father Christmas being there. And these being things from legend and folklore which can prepare us for a true understanding of divinity, prepare us for the coming of Aslan. They aren't worthless, but they aren't the thing itself. And it will be a mistake, I think, for this novel seems to tell us, either to throw them away or to fixate upon them rather than the things that they point to and the things they can educate us about. So that's why I've taken that rather long way around talking about the figure of Father Christmas here, because it seems to me to be plugged into the folkloric and folktale and legendary elements of this novel in quite a precise way. Not a way, and I keep saying this, but not a way that necessarily means Lewis wrote this down in a notebook and we'll find a diagram at some point, if only because his notebooks have been so well read already. But we're going to find a diagram, and he sat out and thought how he would make this progression. But that his mind and his imagination, which had brooded on these things so long, was preparing the reader for the appearance of the lion later on. So that's what struck me about this chapter. As I've said before, I'd be really interested to know what struck you about it, so do please leave comments below. Next episode, we're going to look at chapter 11, Aslan is Nearer, which begins, Edmund, meanwhile, had been having a most disappointing time, and runs all the way to, if either of you mention that name again, said the witch, he shall be instantly killed. So I look forward to talking to you about it soon.